and welcome to the Full Scottish on Broadcasting Scotland. I'm Ruth Watson. My guests today are Emma Harper, SNP MSP for South Scotland region, and Dr. Kirsty Hughes, former Director of the Centre for European Studies and international commentator. Hello, lassies, and thank you very much for joining me today. We've got an action-packed programme ahead of us. Lots to talk about, but I shall come to you just after today's Ukraine update on day 634 of Russia's war in Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has sanctioned 37 Russian groups and 108 people, including a former prime minister and a former education minister, and said he aimed to fight wartime abductions of children from Ukraine and other Russian terror. Ukrainian officials said on Saturday that the armed forces shot down 29 of 38 drones in an overnight raid. More than 400 towns and villages in the south, southeast and north of the country were affected by the drone attacks, including an oil refinery that was hit in Odessa. Ukrainian troops are working to push back Russian forces positioned on the east bank of the Dnipro River, the military has said, a day after Ukraine claimed to have secured multiple bridgeheads on that side of the river that decides the country's partially occupied Kherson region. 2 Ukrainian emergency workers were killed in Zaporizhia region by Russian rocket attacks on Saturday. Ukrainian police said 7 people were also injured when Russia fired a series of rocket strikes at the village of Komishuvka, close to the front line of the Zaporizhia region, which Russia claimed to have annexed last year. Ukraine's armed forces claimed to have killed another 620 Russian soldiers on Friday during operations. In response, Russia said it had heavily bombed Ukrainian forces near the river and killed about 75 soldiers. In an intelligence briefing, the UK Ministry of Defence noted Russian forces were suffering particularly heavy casualties in fighting around Avdiivka, one of 3 areas seeing heavy ground fighting. Despite the heavy fighting, the Ministry of Defence said neither side was making significant progress. On Saturday, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán told a congress of his Fidesz party that Hungary must say no to the current European model built in Brussels, as his government continues to object to Ukraine joining the EU. The German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, has called on the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, to take the first step towards a peaceful resolution to the conflict in Ukraine. More than 100 Russian doctors have signed a joint letter calling on Putin to release a woman jailed for a supermarket protest against the war in Ukraine. A St. Petersburg court last week sentenced Alexandra Skolichenko, 33, to 7 years in prison for spreading false information after she swapped supermarket price tags with slogans criticizing Russia's offensive in Ukraine. Ukraine has been the target of nearly 4,000 cyber attacks since the invasion began, 3 times higher than before, according to Ukrainian officials who oversee cyber defences. Well, that's the news coming from Ukraine. We move now to news in the Middle East and situation in Gaza and really sort of the domestic politics coming out of this horrific situation. The World Health Organization calls the Al-Shifa hospital a death zone as Israeli airstrikes on a United Nations school kills 50 people. The death toll in Gaza is now over 11,470 Palestinians, including 4,707 children and 3,155 women. And there are growing international calls for a ceasefire. However, this week, the UK Parliament voted against an SNP ceasefire motion. Without irony, Conservative and Labour commentators are saying the UK has no ability to influence the US or Israel. So, Kirsty, I'll come to you first on this sort of international commentator's hat on. It's rather a bizarre thing after years of having this special relationship and, Britain's place in the world stage as a mover and an influencer. Suddenly, Westminster seems to be like a dog with its tail between its legs over Gaza, which, of course, the UK has got a very long and difficult history with. Many say that part of the reason we are where we are is because of Britain's actions. So, what's your take on this week's events in Westminster and the global move with people, more nations speaking out in defence of Gaza and human rights, while obviously, acknowledging that what Hamas did was appalling. The slaughter of 11,470 Palestinians surely can't go unspoken.
I think just first to say something on Gaza, because the situation there is appalling. It's a massacre, I think, and that comes before anything we might say about Westminster. And I think it's hard to recall any situation where you've seen such an outcry from the different UN bodies, from the different big international charities, the Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, MSF. And we've seen obviously previous attacks on Gaza in the past. I myself was once in Gaza. That was in 2010 after the 2009, late 2008, 2009 attacks, and the situation was desperate then. But we've seen almost 3/4 of the population displaced, huge amount of Gaza destroyed, and so the moral and human case, as well as the political case, is surely for a ceasefire. So if we then look at Westminster, if the current line from some Conservative and Labour sides is that we have no influence, this is bizarre. I mean, yes, I think the UK has often been the minor partner in the special relationship without influence. But does that mean we have no foreign policy? Does that mean we don't comment on and try to influence world affairs? Okay, we're not part of the European Union. We don't liaise so well with our European partners anymore. But this seems like almost like a deliberate distraction in a way to get us starting to talk about influence instead of talking about ceasefire and the situation in Gaza. And the government has a position. Westminster MPs voted, and shockingly, they chose to not vote to support a ceasefire. So we can talk about influence, and it's not an irrelevant question, because how do we get Israel to stop what it's doing? But to entangle that with whether a ceasefire is right or wrong is bizarre at best.
I mean, Emma, there's surely a moral case, even if we have no influence. Surely the moral case is clear that people should be standing up for international law and human rights. I mean, I was looking at a comment, statement said that I think it was a Blinken, the US ambassador, was making a year ago about Russia bombing hospitals and schools and the mass slaughter of civilians in Ukraine, and quite rightly saying that it was a war crime and should stop. And yet he's silent about, or he's not as vociferous about, the situation, which is parallel and with greater lethality in Gaza. I mean, what is your take on the moral obligation for not only politicians to stand up and say no, but for individuals, as we're seeing across the world, to stand up and say no?
Yep. Well, so I agree with Kirsty. We absolutely need to, we can't just turn our back on the people in Gaza and any loss of life or any civilians is absolutely tragic. And I heard the other night when I was at an event from one of my Conservative colleagues basically saying we have no influence, so therefore what, we do nothing, and I think this is the line that they're troping out right now. And and what I think we need to be doing is be quite vociferous and vocal and unite and stand together with the aid agencies and the World Health Organization and the UN. And we need to, when we're looking at the pictures and the images of wee babies in, in neonatal ICU, it's pretty tragic what we're seeing, and my colleague was basically justifying bombing on the Al Shifa hospital, because he said that it was that's where the Hamas arms were being stored. It's like there is no justification for bombing any hospital or healthcare facility, and I think we absolutely need to be standing up and discussing this and being quite vocal. And we've got a debate this week in Parliament on Tuesday about the issues in Gaza. So I think we will not get peace unless a ceasefire happens. We can't even begin the process of peace discussions unless there's a ceasefire, and that's what I am absolutely right behind. We need to support a ceasefire. Otherwise, we'll just continue to see civilian lives being lost. And for me as a nurse, seeing what's happening in a hospital, it's absolutely tragic.
I mean, it is very alarming, to say the least, that Palestinians were told by the Israelis, I mean, you're talking about the Gaza Strip is about the size of the island of Arran, and there's 2 million people crammed into it, and their ability to leave is controlled by Israel. So the Israeli government told the Palestinian people to move to southern Gaza. People using the route they were told to use were bombed and shot at. There are snipers targeting women and children in hospitals. And now the people in southern Gaza, the so-called safe zone, are being told that they need to evacuate again. But where do they go? And in terms of how big does a nation have to be before it has influence, when you look at nations around the world that are, people are mobilizing and demonstrating, people are in Australia are blocking arms being sent out, shipped out to Israel from Australian units there. I mean, Kirsty, the how small an influence does somebody have to have before they actually can just stand up and say, I say no, not in my name?
I think in that sense, we all have influence. It's not, we feel so powerless in the face of these indeed war crimes and the destruction of Gaza. And as you say, having told the population to move to the southern part of Gaza, now some areas of the south are being told to move again. And you wonder, what plan do the Israelis have in mind? Are they trying to make it impossible for anybody to live in Gaza, so that even though at the moment the Egyptian government says it doesn't want refugees moving into Egypt, you have to wonder what the Israelis are trying to do here. But we can always, at the very least, we can bear witness. We can say not in my name, and however you do that, whether it's at a demonstration, whether it's writing to a politician, whether it's, I saw a group of Irish writers had come together to protest and to demand a ceasefire. There's always something you can do, and then how that adds together is a political question, obviously, as well as a moral question. And the US can and periodically does ignore its allies, but depending on where different European states position themselves, and I include the UK in that, in the sense we're still European, even though we're not in the EU, obviously, then that is telling both the US and Israel something. And obviously President Macron in France has already called for a ceasefire. So I think it's about the cumulative nature of these pressures. And I also think, it's about long run damage. And some people say if you call for a ceasefire, you've got to somehow have a perfect plan for what comes afterwards. But the current destruction and bombing and forced population displacement is unacceptable, whatever comes afterwards. So I think we have to get to the ceasefire. That is definitely, surely going to protect the lives of more hostages as well in Gaza, and then we can see where we go after that. And there is a rather awful experience from the past when Israel has bombed Gaza in the past, and frankly, despite the Hamas rockets, it's as we see, it's pretty much doing this with impunity. that they see how long they can bomb before the international outcry becomes too much. And this particular attack on Gaza is obviously much, much worse than anything that's gone before. But is there still that dynamic there in some way? So is there a moment, I've been talking about bombing, but of course there's been a 16-year-long blockade of Gaza. Israel turned off water at the start of this conflict. People, according to the World Health Organization, are starving. They're letting in a mere 2 fuel trucks a day. So the urgency of the situation, is obvious to everybody except those who apparently say Israeli self-defense means what we're seeing at the moment. So I think, yes, there is influence. And in any conflict, I was on the demonstrations 20 years ago against the Iraq War. That didn't succeed, but it creates a debate. It creates a global argument about right, wrong, where you draw the line, and so forth. So that's all part of it.
I mean, certainly the very far right Zionist wing of the Israeli government has got government ministers and politicians coming out on Israeli television and doing interviews, basically saying that they're looking to eradicate Palestinians and Gaza, and now settlers are being armed, and there are incursions and people being displaced on the West Bank, which has got nothing to do with Gaza. It's got nothing to do with Gaza or Hamas. I mean, Hamas isn't a feature there. So, from a political point of view, it does look like there's a sort of bigger game at play, a lethal and murderous game at play with the far right Israeli government, which many Israelis are protesting against. I mean, Emma, the looking at the local politics of it, and I'm hesitant to talk about party politics when we're talking about people dying. So I'm not sort of asking to go down a sort of perhaps disrespectful tribalist route when we're talking about the slaughter of civilians. But in terms of the moral courage of politicians, I mean, I see that Richard Leonard has stepped out away from the sort of the, in some ways, I don't know if it's the Labour whip or not, but he's coming out and he says he needs to see a ceasefire. But I found it quite disturbing to see Anna Sarwar trying to justify why Labour in Scotland would vote for a ceasefire, but why it was quite correct for Labour in London not to vote for a ceasefire. I mean, how again, without trying to turn the murder of people into a party game. I'm not trying to do that, but how does the Scottish situation show the influence of Scotland and moral stature there within the Parliament in Scotland, but also perhaps the speaks of a sort of perhaps a growing chasm between politics in Scotland and England, and yet Sarwar trotting to heel when called.
Yeah, I mean, we must remember that Labour in Scotland isn't Scottish Labour. It is the branch office of the UK government's Labour Party, and we do have a growing chasm, differences in Scotland with our politics. I just wish that the Conservatives would, grow a backbone and demand that civilians. Are stopped. This collective punishment absolutely needs to be stopped on civilians. And when I've been at events in Parliament in the last couple of weeks, we've seen what's happening in Gaza. It's really. It is really horrifying to see, and it's changing pretty rapidly. But I've been at events where I've heard Anas Sarwar obviously condemn Hamas and want to support what is the better plan, which is the ceasefire, so that we can begin, a peace process. But It is interesting to hear from you, Ruth, about Richard Leonard as, maybe taking a different view now, but my colleagues in Parliament that are Labour colleagues, some of them are very, very vocal. Pauline McNeill is one as well that has been in support of Palestine over many, many years. So I think what we need to do is just remember we should continue to highlight the differences in Scotland versus England. And, the First Minister has absolutely been excellent at leading the way of demanding ceasefire and peace. And the First Minister has been really, diligent in exploring with all communities, all faith communities on either side of this conflict, to look at how we in Scotland can at least lend our voice and lend our support, so that if we can do that, maybe we will end up with a process where the UK government finally gets on board and changes their tactic, because this turning your back and just saying we don't have an influence is absolutely wrong.
Yeah, I mean, one could say it's moral cowardice in the face of the slaughter of innocents. So moving on to Rwanda, the UK Supreme Court has rejected the UK government's Rwanda refugee plans as unlawful, but will Rishi Sunak's plan to pass a new law to make at Westminster make Rwanda safe for refugees? And what would breaking international law say about the UK? I mean, this is, again, as a journalist watching this, I'm horrified on a number of levels. But in terms of protecting democracy at its most basic, it is a remarkable thing to see the UK government basically condemning a judgment of the UK Supreme Court and trying to pass it off as something a bit European. I mean, Kirsty, in terms of the UK's standing in the world community, what does this kind of shenanigans tell the international community about how serious a nation the UK is? And are we in danger of losing democracy or the rule of law as we've known it?
I think it's a really good question. As you say, Sunak, instead of going, okay, that's the UK's top court, the Supreme Court, it went against us, we're going to go away and reflect. He just said, oh, we're going to declare sort of elective dictatorship maybe on this, that we're going to declare Rwanda safe. We're going to ignore the fact that it was a unanimous Supreme Court judgment. And I think, your question makes me think back to some of the first years of Brexit, the legal and political row over Boris Johnson trying to prorogue Parliament, the Daily Mail putting pictures of judges, British judges, on its front page as I can't remember if they called them traitors, but that was the general impression. And the impact of all that, certainly in the European Union, but more widely internationally at the time, was for people to say, what's happened to Britain, what's happened to its democracy, what's happened to its more measured politics. Now, we might not agree with all of their impressions of what the UK used to be like, but people were deeply shocked and worried. And so seeing the way Rishi Sunak is now behaving around the Supreme Court and the Rwanda case, and also trying to, as you say, blame European judges, will reinforce those views. There might have been some people who thought, oh, well, at least the EU-UK relationship has calmed down recently. Rishi Sunak managed to agree the Windsor framework for Northern Ireland, belatedly managed to make the UK a participant in the Horizon basic scientific research program and all those things. So I think it tells us that the Tories are that populist right to far right party that we've seen with Brexit, with very little respect for the truth, with its own media supporters in that. Obviously, I think people will also look at that. A lot of when international different countries look at the UK at the moment, they're aware there's a general election coming in a year. They're hoping that that's going to be a much improved situation under a potential Labour government. But it does look, and has looked for several years now, a bit like the situation in the States, where, as we know, democracy is under pressure, and we've had President Biden now calm things down, but there's a chance that Trump could be back next year. So it does raise all those wider questions about the quality of our democracy. There's also stories this week about the extent to which civil servants in the UK are investigating experts, and whether they've criticised government policy and what their tweets have said, and therefore whether they can be invited to government events and conferences. This is very shocking. I remember back in the 1990s getting invited to UK government events on enlarging the EU eastward. And I had some criticisms of government policy, and I had British diplomats say to me, well, we invite you along, Kirsty, to show the new applicant countries, as they were then, from Eastern Europe, that we're perfectly happy with democratic debate in our country, in the UK. So, how much have we changed since then? I think it's deeply disturbing.
It was the headline, I believe, was "Enemies of the People" was when the judges were put up, and in terms of, I mean, I was seeing one of the teaching unions in England saying that there was evidence that their teachers, even their teaching staff, were being monitored as to what kind of tweets and output was happening, and people's promotions were depending on that and otherwise. So, I mean, Emma, in terms of Rwanda, I actually know some people who were sort of involved diplomatically with Rwanda, and was chatting to them recently about this, and they were saying that obviously, sort of Kigali, there are real issues going on because there's so much pressure from the countries bordering Rwanda that actually there's still a tinderbox element, that the Tutsi politics haven't gone away, although within Rwanda it's much better. But there are other countries around who want to destabilize Rwanda because it is such a mineral-rich country. But they were of the view that it was absolutely not only bonkers but dangerous for refugees to be sent there. And I mean, how much of this do you think is racist? Because how many Albanian refugees do you think they were planning to send to Rwanda? I mean, is it, there's a limited number of people that are going to be going that would have been sent to Rwanda because the capacity isn't there. The housing that Suella Braverman was posing beside it has been revealed as actually social housing for Rwandans. It had been built for Rwandan people, so not where refugees would be sent. And I mean, in terms of the scale of people that were being sent, so if you can sort of unpick not only Rwanda as a dangerous place where people, quite frankly, won't have their civil rights recognized, especially if they're gay, but also in terms of the whole, the sort of the racial bias that it seems to me that this is an inherently racist policy, but I mean what's your perspective on Rwanda as a policy for dealing with immigration, bearing in mind that France has offered the UK a process by which they could process refugees or applications of refugees who want to come to the UK, and bearing in mind that 80%, I think it is, of refugees who have their asylum claim processed are successful, and also there is no legal way by which refugees can come to the UK and claim asylum. There's so all of that, unpick that. We've got 3 minutes.
Wow. Wow, Ruth, it's going to be difficult to unpick all of that, but what you're describing, what Kirsty's describing, is it's the whole process for Rwanda, and deporting people in order to have their asylum processed is absolutely wrong. We should be doing it in this country. And I know you're right about France had offered to help process people. I mean, we've got, I think on a quick look this morning, there's about 960,000 unfilled jobs in the whole of the UK, and the number of people seeking asylum each year is about 97,000, so way less than the jobs that we have. You know, we could be doing things differently. We could be supporting asylum seekers into employment in this country, and I think the additional challenges are, you know, unaccompanied children that are seeking asylum as well. So there's, the whole thing is so, it's so complex, but we know that in Scotland, you know, we need people to move here. We need people to support jobs in hospitality, in agriculture, in social care. You know, we could be changing the processes and allow people who are seeking asylum to embed in our communities. I mean, they're not seeking asylum here just because they they are wanting to be in another country. They're escaping horrors in their own area. So, and they're choosing to come to the UK, and we would welcome people in Scotland and help support them into housing, into employment, because we need that for our own area, for our own Scotland. So, you know, the whole thing is, you know, the whole Rwanda process, and, you know, Suella Braverman is no longer the Home Secretary, and I'm very glad about that. But seeing her standing in front of housing that they think is all wonderful for people who are going to be deported, you know, I think the Supreme Court made the correct decision, and Rishi Sunak is now just doubling down and disagreeing with the highest court in the UK. And again, you're right, he's blaming the EU. So I don't know if he's just trying to put that spin so that people across the UK think that he's saying the right thing, when actually, no, we should be doing what we can to help people who are seeking asylum. And one thing that we should be doing is helping them to, you know, welcome them to the country and support them into housing and into employment.
Well, it is curious, isn't it, that when the Supreme Court made the ruling on Scotland's right to hold a referendum, that was the last word on the matter. But anyway, obviously the Westminster government has got other views when they don't quite agree with the judgment. So moving on to the budget, as Jeremy Hunt prepares for his budget this week, there has been a briefing frenzy with proposals to cut taxes paid for by cutting the Social Security budget, hitting the poorest in society. What measures did the Chancellor introduce to help with the cost of living crisis? Well, I mean, I'm not even going to get started on this one, Emma. I shall come to you first. So taxes for the richest shall be cut. But the single mother or somebody with long-term disabilities might lose the right to access to the NHS, according to some of the wildest suggestions coming out. I mean, have the Tories just run out of ideas and they're just now trying to whip the poorest in society to make the wealthiest feel secure in their endless sumptuous wealth? I mean, it just seems, how can this be justified after decades of 13 years of austerity and a cost of living crisis? I mean,
Yep.
do you have any idea
Yep.
what's going on? Any sort of sane Tories that you talk to who can kind of explain to you what's going on?
I mean, it's just apparent that, yeah, let's just blame poor people for the problems with the finances in the UK. And, you know, we're hearing, I suppose, pre-statements from the autumn budget. It's awful. I've seen the many tweets or posts on X around how there are people that are disabled that will never be able to work for whatever reasons, and now they're feeling totally persecuted. You know, what we need is a chancellor that supports helping people with mortgage payments, tax relief. We've got issues with food prices and energy prices, and we're just ahead of the coldest months for winter, and we want to, I suppose, support Jeremy Hunt to make the cost of living more bearable for people, because right now we've got people that are in total crisis and destitution mode. So I think some of the things that he could be doing is giving people like mortgage tax relief and reduction in their energy costs as well, and extending that. So I think the whole issue around protecting rich people by punishing poor people seems to be the modus operandi of this UK government. And 13 years of austerity is we're seeing that the poverty and that's happening in Scotland as a result of Westminster policies, and the Scottish government is mitigating constantly these UK government inflicted austerity measures. And we actually could be doing stuff a lot better in Scotland if we had our own full fiscal control. And obviously that means let's independence is a way for us to go, so that we can escape these right-wing Tory tax relief for rich people and punishing poor people policies.
And it's Kirsty, you were have an economics background, I believe, and I mean, when you look at what is happening within the UK government economically, and the impact of austerity on society, the impact of Brexit on people's spending, obviously in a world that's sort of on fire with the climate emergency, we can't have endless growth, but looking at the local economics of, if people have enough money in their pockets, they'll go and they'll support local shops because they can go out for a cup of coffee with their pals, or take the grandchildren out, whatever. When you look at what is happening with the economic plan that's coming out, and even looking at some of the, Labour seems to be fine with most of this. What's your take on not only the economic impact of these proposed suggested tax cuts, but also the UK and Scotland's standing as a country that is serious about working for everyone in society? I mean, I would imagine that many of our European neighbours are just looking on aghast. Wes Streeting's talking about holding the door open to privatisation of the NHS. You've got Scotland trying to being praised for being progressive with its model of sort of the Scottish child payment, giving £25 to everybody who has young children. But I mean, this is surely just throwing an egg cup of water on a ship that's burning.
I think, two political points to begin with. Firstly, we've just been talking about Rwanda and the demonisation of asylum seekers, and of course this Tory government has a long history also of demonising people on benefits, both of which is unacceptable. It's worth reminding ourselves, of course, that of the over 4 million children living in poverty in the UK, 2/3 or more are actually in working families. So huge amount to do to tackle those shocking numbers. And the second political point is that this is, of course, an election budget in some sense. And I can't imagine there's any Tories who think that the general election can be won. But I think when we look at some of the statements Rishi Sunak is making, there's maybe an attempt to lose less badly, or even to shore up whatever his own self-image is of himself as Prime Minister. But also, I think, to create problems for Labour and to find issues that they think are salient with that narrow group that perhaps of voters that Tories and Labour are targeting, to challenge Labour and Keir Starmer to say, no, we wouldn't do that. No, we wouldn't put up inheritance tax. No, we wouldn't put even more pressure on people struggling to get by on benefits. So I think that's the overall political side of it, if you like. I think in terms of the way that the people in many EU member states looks at the UK links to what we actually need economically, because I think if you go to France or the Netherlands or Germany, you'll see even if you're visiting and therefore not really using their health services, for instance, you'll see a much better public and social infrastructure than the UK, which has been run down for so many years now. So I think a budget that was focused on the real needs of the UK as a state would look at the state of public infrastructure, the state of the NHS, the state of our schools, poverty and child poverty, and try and the net zero commitments, and try and find a way to modernize the whole economy and society in a green direction, in a fair direction, and in a way to tackle those major challenges. Obviously, that is not, sadly, what anybody expects to happen. But that is what you would want to happen, and that's what you'd certainly want to see Labour say that they would do. But they've put so much, I think, excessive focus on being financially responsible, as if they can. I think they've got this terrible fear of being painted like Liz Truss, but Liz Truss crashed the economy in a couple of weeks, and there's nothing to suggest that this Labour government, if it arrives after the election, would do that. So I think we're looking to a damaging budget, pre-election tax giveaways. Whether he'll go as far as cutting the inheritance tax, he's getting apparently some pushback from some Tory MPs. So we will see, but it certainly won't take us in the direction we need to go, obviously.
Well, that last line takes me perfectly on to the Scottish Government's launch this Friday of its paper, An Independent Scotland in Europe, setting out its proposals for Scotland's path to rejoining the EU and the benefits to people and businesses in Scotland as an independent nation if we were to achieve independence, and then would be applying to join the EU. Are these plans realistic, and how does ScotGov persuade the majority of Scots who want to rejoin the EU that voting for Scottish independence is the best future for Scotland? Well, Kirsty, your little Twitter fingers were very busy over the last couple of days. I've been following you with great interest, as of course I urge everybody to do, because you're you don't tweet frequently or post frequently, but when you do, it's always worth cogitation. So after you've had a couple of days to consider this paper, what's your main takes from this? Independence and back in the EU with a hop and a skip and a song in our hearts?
I think in a way, yes. I think it's a very serious paper. I think some of the earlier papers in this new Scotland policy paper series the Scottish Government has done have not exactly energised the debate. Some of them have been more substantive than others. I think this is a very serious paper. Don't be put off by it saying 80 pages, by the way. There's a one-page summary at the start, and at the heart of the paper is 30 to 40 pages, I would say. One of the things I really like about it is that it makes a sustained, serious case for what you get from joining the European Union, what the European Union is, how you join. They list a whole series of benefits that go from holiday makers to students to business to climate, and they also explain how it works. And it's easy to give sound bites, and we don't have time for that much more. But of course, one thing an independent Scotland in the EU would get is it would be at the top, most powerful European summit meetings that happen at least every 3 months with the other leaders. It would have a voice, it would have a vote. In some cases, it would have a veto. But the paper also explains the myriad of literally hundreds of committees in the EU, that they might be a subcommittee on transport or on some subpart of climate, it might be on defence and foreign policy issues, and the UK is no longer in the room for any of those, and independent Scotland would be in the room for those. It also sets out the fact that the accession process is quite tough. you've got this huge amount of law and issues that the EU covers, and you have to show that you're up to speed and fully aligned back with the EU like we were when we were in the EU. But it also shows that this is a perfectly straightforward process. All European states can apply to join the EU, and it needn't take that long. When we look at I was talking earlier about the Central and East European countries who joined in 2004. Their negotiations took one group 4 years, one group 2 years. So this doesn't have to take forever. And I think it's very easy in these debates, and we've seen it in the past, to end up talking only about, oh, but there'll be an EU border between Scotland and England. Yes, there will. The paper doesn't say as much as I'd have liked on that. We'll have to meet EU deficit criteria. Yes, we will. Again, the paper doesn't sort of skirts that one. We'll have to commit to join the euro. Yes, I think the paper's really interesting on that. It says we aim to move to a Scottish currency as the first step, in parallel with the time of the years it would take to actually join the EU. So I think the paper's bit the bullet on some of those issues, currency, avoided the issue on issues like deficit, but actually made that bigger case about that we can get in the EU and why we'd want to get in the EU. And just one last point, it doesn't talk about the European Economic Area. I know some people would prefer that an independent Scotland joined Norway in the European Economic Area first. But I think if you read this paper, it makes the case for how you get a real say, even as a small state, in the European Union. And so if you really want to think about it in the whole, and not only the tricky issues, then I think that is what this paper does.
Well, that's a really good précis of your weeks or your weekends, twitting and tweeting and posting and zeeting and skeeting, because it is a chunky bit of work, but you have given a really nice summary of it. Now, Emma, I know that you're a passionate European, and I know that many in your area of Scotland are also passionate Europeans, and especially when it comes to the sort of the economics of Brexit and the impact on the fishing and farming community and holiday areas and all the rest. But I mean, obviously there is, I mean, we've got a minute and a half, so be brief, but obviously the issue of a border. Now, I've heard it discussed. I had a very angry Englishman telling me why I was so wrong and we couldn't possibly afford it. And I was pointing out that because of the common travel area, then there would be no border for people, but with the but that at the border, then obviously there would need to be checks on freight. And this seems to be something which, there's going to be razor wire for 90 miles. We think, yeah, I don't think that's right, mate. So how do you sell the prospect of an independent Scotland back in the EU in your border countries, sort of the area that you're in?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, first of all, Kirsty did an absolutely amazing summary there of the paper that's just came out. I think being part of the world's largest single market and with reduced barriers to trade and free flows of data and less bureaucracy is something that we should all welcome. The border, as you're saying, it's something that I do think about, and I know I've been misquoted about it in the past. I've never said I wanted a hard border, but what we have is, we know that we're not going to have 90 miles of razor wire, from Gretna along the way to like Eyemouth. It's not going to happen. We have already got free flow back and forward across the border with people who live in one side and work in the other side. My sister lives in Ecclefechan and works in Carlisle. So, borders can be really successful. The checks can be done remotely. We see how the borders work between other independent countries like Norway and Sweden. So I think people are being scaremongered into showing that they're going to have to show their passport to see their grandparents across the border. We have a common travel area that's well established since 1920, and I think what we would want is obviously the ability for people to move back and forward easily. So I think it's in one of the previous papers, they basically proposed that we would have the similar opportunities as what has been created in Ireland and Northern Ireland. So we know that other countries manage absolutely no problem, and that's what it would be up to the UK government to agree to make it as easy as possible. So there might need to be some checks on phytosanitary products, but that what we've seen is with other countries, the digital remote processes are how it's managed. So we, I mean, others will be able to talk about it probably better than I can. But I think yesterday I was at an event. It was a European Movement in Scotland event, and we had great discussions about how we are going to be better off back in the EU, and that's what we need to be focusing on and looking forward to is being part of the bigger European network with a voice at the table, so that we can be heard. Because right now it's never happened for Scotland, but we should be able to have a voice and be a part of decisions, looking forward to a successful nations of European partners that collaborate and work together to support and tackle like the climate emergency, biodiversity emergency, all of that. So I think this paper that's came out just 2 days ago is something that we should be focusing on and looking at the aspects in it to make sure that we can be a successful, progressive European country.
Well, I'm very pleased to say I completely misread my clock, so we've got another 8 minutes to go. So, Kirsty, I'm going to come back to you and ask you about the potential for Scotland, and also Scotland's democracy, because there's a draft constitution, and that would embed the rights of Scots and sort of really set out the social contract between Scotland, the nation, and Scotland, our people, all of our people. I mean, when you look at the constitution, when you look at the work being done, how ready do you think Scotland, and how ready do you think the people of Scotland are to be a nation and back in the EU?
I think it's a good question. I think in many ways, and lots of people from different angles have said this. The independence debate seems to have gone quiet in a way, and although the SNP has gone down some in the polls, the independence numbers have roughly stayed balanced. And so I'm interested to see what communication strategy actually the Scottish government has got, for instance, around this EU paper and how to take it out there. Because some people say on European issues that we should be getting the EU to tell Scotland that of course it can join the EU, and because we're a special case because of Brexit. And my reply to that has always been, well, it's a very nice idea, but it's politically it's not going to happen. The EU is not going to interfere in that way in the constitutional politics of what is now a third country state, as they call it. And actually that has been recognised both under Nicola Sturgeon and under Humza Yousaf, that an independent Scotland should expect to join the EU through a normal accession process and not through asking as a special case. But at the same time, if you can talk to experts in the EU, experts like me, you can talk to former politicians around Europe or current members of the European Parliament, you will find a lot of people who will say, well, firstly, of course, an independent Scotland can apply to join because any European country can. And actually, of course, if that was your choice, you'd be welcome and you'd find a very positive dynamic. So I think it's about injecting that kind of confidence into the debate. And yes, we have to have some of these tough discussions around the border and around not just what happens to people crossing it, as Emma was talking about. What is the economic impact of the border, and how fast can we change the economic dynamics? Because it's true, we trade more with the rest of the UK than the EU, although actually on manufacturing goods, it's almost the same amount, interestingly enough. But what is the transition process to independence? It's fine to say that, in 10 or 20 years' time, we could look like Belgium or Denmark or Ireland, whatever your preferred comparator country is. But I think, as well as trying to engender that kind of energy and positivity, you've got to explain the process of getting there. So I was thinking before this program today, we have proportional representation for the Scottish Parliament. Obviously, we have first past the post for Westminster. So we haven't got an experience of living in a state where you elect the Parliament of the state, not just the country, through PR. So I think the politics of Scotland is going to really change. It's going to be new for everybody. It's going to be different and on the whole, I imagine, in a better way. So I think it's about imagining that future. And as you say, coming back to the way you started the question, so if you look at the type of written constitution we might have, and that it would be a written one, unlike the UK, and you look at how countries, all sorts of different countries, have joined the EU, and you talk about that. And it doesn't mean that you can't have the tough conversations about border or deficits, but it has to be in the context of the whole thing. And I feel the energy levels are quite low at the moment. And I mean, the world is going through all sorts of different crises, and so are we at home. So it's maybe not surprising, but that's, I think, the sort of discussion we need.
So, Emma, it is often said that, perhaps those who wish to control populations sort of harry them in the way, if you watch orcas, a pod of orcas hunting a poor selkie, they'll harry it and put it under such stress that the poor creature can't think clearly, and therefore it is easy prey. And politicians who wish to keep control over a population often will use poverty and the distractions of misery to try and keep people disengaged. And we're seeing, Scotland's a nation that has had democracy ever removed from it, so that it's now so decentralised. Leslie Riddick speaks about this quite often and quite powerfully, about the importance of social engagement. Given how rubbish the SNP's messaging can be, and given how poor on occasion the Scottish Government's PR can be, how do we get the message out that independence is a really good thing, and that we would have social change, we would have democratic change, we would give people more power, more say, there would be more social engagement, and actually, the cliche is the future is ours to write. There's this is a really good document. I'm very impressed with it. I'm very impressed with the opportunities for the people of Scotland. But who in the Scottish Government's PR team, who in the SNP's PR team is actually gonna have the get up and go to get up and get this message out in a positive way?
You've probably heard me speak about it before, Ruth, about the how do we get the messaging out, because the media don't seem to favour, whether it's print media or television media, don't seem to favour the SNP's voice. And when I lived in California, I know that when election cycles came around, keeping people fearful, keeping people poor is a deterrent to getting out any vote as well. And so maybe that's what we're witnessing here, because when I try and engage people or speak to people, my casework in the office has just gone through the roof because of the Tory inflicted austerity and the cost of living crisis. We were hit with Brexit, we were hit with the cost of living crisis and COVID. So I think people are still emerging from the pandemic, and that we still have people that don't want to leave their homes. We've changed our whole work habits where people are now working from home. But and so if people are so busy and so fearful about paying their bills or feeding their wains, then they're going to be probably less involved in what's out there in the political bubble. And, I speak about it with my colleagues, and I think what we're all experiencing the same kind of disengagement, the flattened kind of apathy, even. So what we should be doing is, I agree with Leslie Riddick about social engagement, further local democracy, local devolution, making sure that we have people empowered. So I've seen it in my last 7 years as an MSP. The when you empower people and you give them agency, you give them the ability to make their own choices, and you give them money to help them to do that, you actually then end up with quite successful communities within our whole society and our whole area. I've seen the way that Stranraer has totally grasped the empowerment idea, and now they've got this attitude of, yeah, we can do this. So I think we need to, I don't know how to get the message out, is, we've got a rebuttal unit in the making that's going to reboot some of the claims that are made on media. Luckily for me, in Dumfries and Galloway, people don't do Twitter, so that's a win-win right there. So I try and use my social media, whether it's Instagram or Facebook, to get messages out that are positive, that are engaging, that show what we can do as an independent nation. It's not the process of how we get there, it's why we need it. And it's because right now we're mitigating by £700 million Tory inflicted policies. So we just need to help people understand what could be done and what could be different with full fiscal autonomy, for instance. And that's something that it is a challenge because of the constraints that we face with the current print media as well as television media. So we just have to get out and chap doors, talk to people face to face. It's what I do locally, as much as possible.
Well, I used my autonomy to crash the pips, and we're now 2 minutes 14 seconds over the programme, but that's the joyous anarchy of public broadcasting. And you can play your part in sharing the word about Scotland's potential by joining Broadcasting Scotland and being a supporter. You can share the programs, you can talk about us, you can send people the link so that they can watch the kind of news that they're not going to see on the BBC, I'm afraid to say. Well, that's it for this week's Full Scottish. Before I go, I just want you to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Our need to reach our £30,000 target to pay our bills is still pressing. Most of us are volunteers, we don't take a penny, most of us, out of this, but we need this cash to keep the studio, which is actually an amazing state-of-the-art studio. The work that goes on a shoestring budget is incredible, and you guys help make that happen. So if you want to keep having a voice for Scotland that broadcasts regularly, please donate if you can. I know times are tough, but if you've got a fiver on the back of the couch, send it to us. The generosity of our supporters has given us a lot more time. We've raised over 21,000 and we have been able to continue making programmes, but we do need to raise that remaining £9,000. So like I say, if you've got a bobby, chuck it to us. Thank you very much again to my guests, Emma Harper, MSP, and Kirsty Hughes. Thank you guys. It was a really interesting programme. I'm Ruth Watson. Goodbye, and thank you for watching.